Welcome the anointed ones. Nothing wounds the ego quite like the truth showing up without an invitation. There is a split second that almost no one prepares for, the precise instant when someone who constructed their entire sense of self around appearance, dominance, reputation, or superiority suddenly understands that the attention they once enjoyed has quietly transformed into a spotlight they never asked for, one that reveals everything they tried to bury. And here is the part that most people find unbearable to admit. Researchers in psychology have documented for decades that when a person's carefully protected self-image is threatened in public, the brain responds almost identically to the way it processes physical danger. That is how serious the experience of being seen truly feels from the inside. It is not simply uncomfortable or awkward, it registers at the level of survival. Because the ego does not mind being mistaken in silence. The ego only begins to panic when witnesses appear. What intensifies this further is the way that exposure almost never announces itself loudly in the beginning. It starts with tiny fragments that refuse to align, a timeline that cannot hold, a story that shifts without warning, a level of self-assurance that drops from untouchable legend to defensive explanation in a matter of moments. And once people catch that shift, the entire atmosphere transforms. The respect that was once freely given begins to feel uncertain. Even the silence around the person starts to sound different. The truth is that the ego can absorb criticism, can absorb rumors, can even absorb outright failure. What the ego struggles to survive is clarity. And when clarity finally arrives, it does not knock politely. It walks in, takes a seat, and turns the lights on brighter than anyone was prepared for. So what you are about to encounter is not merely embarrassment. It is what unfolds when an identity that was engineered for performance finally meets a reality that refuses to cooperate with the script. And that moment, that is precisely where the real story begins. Number 1. What they called confidence was never confidence at all. It was control wearing the costume of certainty. For years they moved through rooms with a particular kind of gravity, heads turning, voices lowering, people nodding as though their very presence demanded reverence. It looked like confidence. It sounded like confidence. Everyone around them assumed it was confidence. But underneath that polished exterior, what they were actually doing was engineering perception. Every sentence they chose, every gesture they allowed themselves, every deliberate pause was carefully arranged to shape how others experienced them. They were not standing on truth. They were not standing on skill. They were standing on a beautifully constructed illusion of mastery. And illusions, by their very nature, are fragile. Real confidence does not require an audience. Real confidence does not need verification from anyone else to feel solid. It remains steady whether anyone is watching or not, because it is rooted in genuine self-knowledge and earned ability. What they had was something else entirely. Their version of confidence was completely dependent on attention, on approval, and on the absence of close inspection. As long as nobody looked too carefully, it held. As long as nobody pushed back, it held. But the instant someone leaned in, asked the right question, or simply noticed a crack in the facade, the entire structure began to tremble. That is why exposure cuts so deep. It does not just reveal specific mistakes. It uncovers the central lie on which the entire ego was constructed. People watch it collapse, and the person living through it realizes they have nothing beneath them except a carefully curated image. The certainty they carried so proudly, the confidence that made others believe in them, was never truly theirs. It was borrowed from the reactions, the fears, and the assumptions of everyone standing nearby. And that is a particular kind of humiliation that reaches deeper than any insult ever could, because it forces them to look directly at the truth. Everything they had presented as strength was actually armor worn to hide insecurity. Every bit of admiration they collected was temporary, conditional, and could be stripped away at any moment. Real confidence would have survived scrutiny. Real confidence would not have required the spotlight to feel complete. What they possessed was control masquerading as certainty, and once control disappears, certainty evaporates with it. Exposure does not just humble them. It reveals that what everyone admired in the first place was never authentic. It was an act, and acting is exhausting. The moment the audience sees through it, shame arrives uninvited, relentless, and impossible to ignore. Number 2. They did not fear being wrong. They feared being seen clearly. Most people assume that the worst part of being exposed is the moment of being wrong about something. But that is not actually true for someone whose entire identity runs on performance. Being wrong is fixable. Mistakes can be explained, apologized for, and eventually forgotten as time passes. What truly terrifies them is being seen clearly, stripped of all the carefully assembled layers they depended on to feel untouchable. Exposure does not just reveal a misstep, it reveals the distance between the person they presented to the world and the person they actually are behind closed doors. That distance is where shame lives, and it lands harder than any public critique could ever deliver. They spent years crafting a version of themselves that appeared untouchable. Every story, every claim, every little boast served as a piece of armor designed to control how others perceived them. They assumed they could move through life without anyone looking too closely, that no one would catch the inconsistencies, the exaggerations, the half-truths scattered along the way. But when exposure finally arrives, all of that carefully constructed armor shatters in an instant. The world sees them not as the confident, capable person they wanted everyone to believe in, but as someone who has been trying very hard to appear confident and capable. And that realization is corrosive. It eats away at the ego from the inside out because it proves that their identity was never grounded in reality. It was grounded in the perception others had of them. Shame in this context is not loud. It is the quiet, crushing awareness that the self you have relied on was never real. It is watching the people who once nodded and smiled begin to hesitate, begin to question, and begin to look at you differently. And the worst part is that this reckoning is not really about other people's judgment. It is about the internal collapse they can no longer escape. They always knew, somewhere deep down, that the version of themselves they had been projecting was an act. Exposure simply lifts the curtain and forces them to face the truth they had been avoiding. What makes this particular type of shame so intense is that it is irreversible. Being wrong can be corrected. Being misunderstood can eventually be clarified. But once people see you clearly, fully without any of the protective layers you constructed, there is no returning to the way things were. The ego screams in panic because the safety net of perception has been ripped away, leaving only raw, undeniable reality. The person everyone admired was never the person they thought they were, and facing that truth is devastating. Number 3, their authority only functioned while no one asked questions. Authority that is built on silence is always temporary. They walked into rooms filled with people nodding, agreeing, deferring without question, and they came to believe that this was real power. They believed that as long as nobody challenged them directly, their position was secure, their influence unshakable, and their ego beyond reach. But the truth is that authority is not measured by how many people are watching you. It is measured by how you stand when someone actually looks closely. Their so-called authority was a performance, a stage act sustained by the absence of scrutiny. The moment someone dared to ask a real question, to challenge a claim, or to point out a flaw, the foundation they believed was unbreakable began to crack. For them, the silence of others was never peace or genuine respect. It was a mask of compliance. They mistook quiet observation for agreement, and they mistook nodding heads for loyalty. That is why exposure feels catastrophic when it finally arrives. It does not just reveal one mistake or one contradiction. It reveals that the entire architecture of their authority was constructed on a fragile illusion. The more they depended on people not questioning them, the more vulnerable they became to even the smallest disruption. And when exposure comes, that disruption is relentless, unstoppable, and entirely public. Authority that depends on fear, on appearances, or on the avoidance of questions can survive for a stretch, but it collapses instantly under real inspection. People begin connecting dots, noticing contradictions, questioning motives. Those who once deferred without hesitation now begin to hesitate, and that hesitation spreads like a contagion through every room they enter. What they thought was genuine respect turns out to have been temporary compliance. And suddenly the ego that had thrived on admiration faces its own reflection, hollow, performative, and utterly exposed. The harshest truth of all is that real authority does not need silence to exist. True authority holds its ground even when challenged, even when questioned, even when the room is full of skeptics. Exposure does not create shame. It reveals that what they called power was never real. It was borrowed energy, dependent on everyone else's inattention, agreement, and fear. And once that borrowed energy is gone, the person is left standing naked in front of the world, facing the devastating realization that their influence, their control, and their sense of superiority were never theirs to begin with. That is the kind of truth that does not just embarrass, it shatters completely. Number 4, they constructed their image far more quickly than they constructed their character. They spent years crafting a persona that looked impressive, polished and untouchable from the outside. Every outfit, every carefully chosen post, every word measured in advance was a brushstroke in a portrait designed to make others believe in their greatness. People admired them, respected them, and often envied them. From the outside, it looked as though they had everything together, as if their life and their identity were solid, immovable, and beyond question. But image grows fast, while character grows slowly. And the painful reality is that you can only maintain a constructed image for so long before reality begins testing the foundation underneath it. Character remains invisible until pressure arrives. It is the quiet strength, the consistent honesty, the ability to own mistakes without panic, and the patience to keep growing over time. Image, by contrast, is loud, flashy, and immediate. It can make someone appear strong without them actually being strong at all. They relied on the rapid construction of their image because it delivered instant results, attention, admiration, and influence. But when exposure finally arrives, it does not examine what looks good or what seems impressive on the surface. Exposure measures what is real, and when people finally notice the difference between the image and the underlying truth, the fall is swift and merciless. They did not just overestimate the power of perception, they underestimated the permanence of truth. The things they had carefully displayed, the version of themselves that commanded respect, turned out to be only skin deep. All it took was a small crack, a question nobody anticipated, or a single person connecting the dots, for years of curated appearance to come crashing down. And when it does, the realization hits harder than embarrassment ever could. It is the awareness that their so-called identity was borrowed from admiration, not earned through integrity. The shame does not just come from being exposed. It comes from realizing that all the effort they poured into appearing impressive never built a foundation strong enough to support who they actually are. People can be fooled for a long time, but character has a way of catching up eventually. And once it does, image becomes meaningless. When that gap between appearance and reality finally reveals itself, the person is left confronting the truth that they invested in the wrong thing. And no amount of charm, no number of stories, and no amount of performance can fix it. Exposure does not just humble them. It unveils the emptiness they had been hiding behind for so long. Number 5, they confused being impressive with being respected. They spent years collecting admiration like trophies, convinced that looking powerful, speaking confidently, and impressing people was the same thing as earning genuine respect. They built an arsenal of achievements, status symbols, and social proof, parading them in front of the world as though they were invincible. To the outside observer, it looked as though they had everything together. People nodded, smiled, and sometimes even flattered them openly. But the problem is that admiration is temporary, conditional, and surface level. Respect is earned, tested, and enduring, and exposure does not care about appearances. It tests the core. Being impressive is easy in controlled environments. You can prepare your words in advance, rehearse your moves, and show the version of yourself that works best in front of others. People clap, they nod, and you feel validated for a moment. But respect is not won through a single performance. It is built slowly over time through consistency, integrity, and the ability to handle challenges without falling apart. Exposure has a way of separating these two things, the impressive and the respected, because it strips away control and reveals who you really are when the spotlight is no longer flattering you and the applause is no longer guaranteed. What hits hardest in these moments is the realization that people had been admiring a mask, not the person beneath it. Every compliment, every nod, every smile that once felt like affirmation suddenly feels like a mirror, reflecting their own misjudgment back at them. They thought they had built authority, influence, and value, but all they had actually built was perception. And when exposure arrives, perception disappears, leaving only reality behind. The shame does not just sting. It cuts deep because it forces them to confront the difference between admiration and respect, between being liked for appearances and being trusted for substance. They learn that being impressive is a performance anyone can applaud, but being respected is something earned quietly, patiently, and relentlessly over time. Exposure does not just humiliate them publicly. It exposes the painful truth that all the effort, all the charm, and all the cleverness they relied on was never enough to earn what truly matters. The ego trembles because it realizes it spent an entire lifetime chasing applause while missing the foundation that could have held it steady. Number 6, their ego was built around being needed rather than being honest. For a long time, they thrived on the idea that people could not function without them. Their identity depended entirely on being essential, on being indispensable, on being the person everyone relied on to solve problems, make decisions, or hold things together. It did not matter whether they were honest, whether they were genuine, or whether they were actually skilled. What mattered was that others depended on the illusion of their importance. That dependency became the cornerstone of their entire ego. They felt untouchable because they had convinced themselves that being needed was the same as being respected or admired. But exposure does not wait for permission. It arrives quietly, in ways that unravel the story they have been telling themselves for years. Suddenly, the people they thought depended on them realized they were perfectly capable on their own. The emergencies that once elevated their presence simply vanish. The praise that once reinforced their importance evaporates. And in that instant, the ego that was built on indispensability faces a brutal reality. Being needed is not the same thing as being valuable, and being relied on is not the same thing as being honest or worthy of trust. What makes this particular type of shame so devastating is that it operates on both levels at once, external and internal. They begin to feel the hollow echo of a life spent convincing themselves and others that their role was critical. The moments when they were needed were never really about their actual contributions. They were about the perception of their influence. Exposure does not just strip them of status, it strips them of the narrative they have clung to, revealing the emptiness that supported their entire sense of self. The irony in this is sharp and relentless. Honesty could have built something lasting, something immune to the scrutiny of time and truth. But they chose the shortcut. They chose being necessary over being genuine. And now the moment of exposure forces them to confront the truth they spent years ignoring. People do not need someone who performs importance. They need someone who is actually authentic. The ego shatters because it discovers that all the dependence, all the admiration, and all the recognition it leaned on was conditional and fragile. The shame is not just public humiliation. It is the piercing realization that they invested in the wrong foundation, and the real measure of worth can never be borrowed from anyone else. Number 7, they never expected evidence to exist. Their ego thrived on assumptions. They believed the world would not look too closely, that people would not notice the small inconsistencies, the tiny exaggerations, the contradictions they left scattered throughout conversations, messages, and actions. They acted as if no one was paying attention, as if their story would simply be accepted at face value, because they told it with enough confidence. That is the dangerous comfort of an ego built on perception. It assumes that the absence of evidence is the same as approval. But exposure does not work that way. Evidence exists, and when it finally surfaces, it does not negotiate. They did not prepare for the reality that people notice patterns, remember details, and connect dots over time. Every lie, every boast, every carefully constructed facade leaves traces behind, and traces accumulate whether you want them to or not. Even the quietest observers collect them without judgment, silently piecing together a puzzle that the ego assumed was impossible to solve. And then one day those pieces align. The discrepancies that once hid in plain sight suddenly form a picture that cannot be denied or explained away. The ego that relied on assumptions finds itself confronting undeniable truth. What makes this especially humiliating is that exposure is not manufactured, it is discovered. The shame is not about someone accusing them. It is about someone proving that the story they relied on as a shield simply does not hold up to scrutiny. Evidence does not care about confidence, charm, or fearlessness. Evidence simply exists, stubborn and patient. And the moment it is recognized, the person who assumed invisibility or ignorance experiences a complete collapse of control. The harsh irony here is unavoidable. For so long, they believed reality could be negotiated through presentation, through persuasion, or through intimidation. But evidence is relentless. It accumulates, it endures, and it exposes. The deeper humiliation comes from the realization that their ego depended on people not noticing. It did not depend on being right, did not depend on being honest, and certainly did not depend on being capable. Exposure strips all of that away, leaving them to confront the fact that the world they assumed was pliable has actually been documenting their truth all along. And once that truth is revealed, the ego does not just shrink, it shatters completely. Number 8. They confused being untouched with being untouchable. For years they moved through life believing they were invincible. Nothing ever seemed to touch them. No criticism stuck, no mistakes lingered, no consequences appeared to land. They interpreted this as proof of untouchability, the kind of quiet supremacy that makes an ego feel permanent and unassailable. They strutted through rooms, made decisions without hesitation, and assumed their position was beyond any threat. But being untouched is not the same thing as being untouchable. Untouchable is earned through substance. Untouched is often just lucky timing, oversight, or the patience of others who have not yet chosen to speak. The moment exposure arrives, that illusion collapses instantly. Suddenly, all the protection they assumed was permanent simply disappears. The problems they ignored or manipulated catch up to them. The inconsistencies they left unchecked are suddenly highlighted. The people who stayed silent out of fear or strategy begin to speak, revealing patterns they assumed no one had noticed. The shield of being untouched was never real armor. It was an illusion, a temporary mirage, and the ego built on it has no real defense when reality finally shows up. What makes this realization especially humiliating is how slowly it creeps in before it hits like a tidal wave. They notice a pause in conversations where once there was immediate deference, a hesitation in trust that was not there before. The small cracks appear at first almost imperceptibly, until the full picture becomes undeniable. The world that seemed to orbit around them, bending to their will, suddenly looks indifferent or worse, fully aware. And the ego that thrived on the assumption of untouchability cannot reconcile the difference between the narrative it built and the truth now being revealed. This is the cruel lesson that exposure teaches. Being untouched is temporary. Being untouchable is earned through substance, through integrity, and through resilience. They spent their life believing the former was enough, and now they are forced to confront just how fragile that fantasy actually was. The shame is relentless because it does not just embarrass them. They realize they mistook the absence of consequence for invincibility. And the moment the truth lands, there is no way to regain the safety they never truly had. Their ego, once inflated by perceived invulnerability, crashes under the weight of reality itself. Number 9, they thought the silence around them meant agreement. For years they walked through rooms assuming that the quiet nods, the blank stares, and the absence of challenge were all signs of agreement. They mistook observation for consent, hesitation for admiration, and patience for loyalty. Every unspoken moment reinforced their ego, making them believe that people were on their side, that their ideas were untouchable, and that their authority was unquestioned. They built their confidence on the assumption that silence equals approval, and that assumption became a dangerous crutch. Exposure shatters that illusion, because silence rarely means what the ego believes it means. People are quiet for countless reasons. Fear, strategy, timing, or simply waiting to see if truth will eventually catch up. Quiet does not always mean support. It often means calculation. And when someone finally breaks the silence, pointing out inconsistencies, revealing contradictions or exposing lies, the ego realizes it had been relying on a mirage. The admiration and compliance they assumed were real were in fact temporary and conditional, dependent entirely on their ability to maintain control of the narrative. The humiliation does not just lie in being contradicted. It lies in realizing how long they misread the signals in front of them. Every silent nod that once inflated their sense of self suddenly feels like a lie. Every unchallenged moment feels like a trap they walked into thinking it was safety. They discover that people were paying attention all along, quietly collecting evidence, remembering details, and connecting dots that the ego assumed did not exist. And once the pattern emerges, once exposure surfaces, the ego cannot defend itself because it was built on misinterpretation rather than reality. What makes this type of shame so intense is that it feels almost intimate, almost personal. It is not just about others seeing the cracks, it is about finally seeing them yourself. They were blind to the fact that their own assumptions were fragile, that silence is never a guarantee, and that people are far more aware than they let on. Exposure forces them to confront the truth that the world is not a reflection of their ego, and that silence has been patiently waiting for the right moment to speak. The fall is inevitable, and the ego, once comfortable in assumed agreement, collapses completely under the weight of reality. Number 10. Their reputation was borrowed rather than owned. For years they moved through life as if their reputation was an unshakable asset, a shield that protected them from any scrutiny or criticism. People admired them, titles elevated them, connections supported them, and associations made them appear untouchable. They believed that this borrowed credibility, these external validations, were the same as having earned respect or trust. Every compliment, every introduction, every nod from someone influential reinforced the illusion that they were solid, dependable, and admirable. But exposure does not care about borrowed status. It strips it away and reveals what, if anything, actually belongs to you. The harsh truth is that a reputation built on association is fragile. It relies on people, circumstances, and perceptions that exist entirely outside your control. One small discrepancy, one witness who remembers things differently, or one unexpected revelation can erase the carefully constructed narrative in a matter of moments. And when that happens, the ego suddenly discovers just how thin the veneer really was. The admiration that once seemed permanent turns out to be conditional, temporary, and external. It was never a reflection of who they truly are. It was a reflection of how others chose to perceive them. Exposure does not create shame. It uncovers the gap between borrowed identity and actual character. What makes this especially painful is the internal reckoning it forces. They may have believed they had earned influence, respect, and authority, but exposure proves that none of it was fully theirs to begin with. People see beyond the borrowed accolades and begin to notice inconsistencies, gaps, and falsehoods. The network of borrowed credibility crumbles, leaving the person to face themselves without the safety net they relied on for so long. The ego, once confident in its untouchability, now trembles because it discovers it never owned what it thought it did. Titles, connections, and associations can create the illusion of permanence, but they cannot replace authenticity. When exposure arrives, the borrowed reputation falls apart, and the person realizes that their entire life was being propped up by perception rather than substance. That realization does not just embarrass, it cuts deeper, shaking the foundation of self-worth that was built entirely on borrowed power. The shame that follows is relentless, because it forces them to confront the truth. They have been admired for all the wrong reasons, and until they earn respect from reality itself, nothing they once relied on will be able to save them. Number 11. They never expected the audience to compare stories. They believed their narrative was untouchable, carefully curated, and delivered just precisely so that no one could question it. Every statement, every explanation, every story they told was designed to control perception, to shape reality in their favor. They assumed people would take what they said at face value, that nobody would notice contradictions, and that different perspectives would never collide. That was their fatal mistake. People remember details, notice patterns, and compare stories even when those stories seem unrelated or insignificant on the surface. Exposure does not come from a single slip. It comes when multiple truths finally align and reveal the cracks the ego never anticipated. They relied on compartmentalization, assuming that if one story worked here and another story worked there, nobody would ever connect the dots. But humans are pattern-seeking creatures by nature. Conversations overlap, timelines intersect, and inconsistencies become impossible to ignore once enough time has passed. Exposure is relentless because it does not need to invent evidence. It simply waits for people to talk, to recall, to remember. What they assumed would remain isolated is suddenly connected, forming an intricate web of truths that demolishes the carefully constructed version of themselves they presented to the world. The humiliation goes deeper than just being caught in a single lie. It is the realization that their entire sense of control was an illusion. They thought they were untouchable because no one could challenge a single story in isolation. They never considered that the world, in its quiet way, was always comparing, analyzing, and remembering every detail they offered. And the moment someone pieces it all together, the ego faces a collapse far more devastating than any single confrontation could ever deliver. What makes this exposure particularly brutal is that it is cumulative. Every small discrepancy that once seemed insignificant becomes a thread. And when enough threads connect, the entire fabric of their ego unravels completely. People suddenly see the contradictions, and the person sees them too. The audience they assumed was passive becomes the judge, and the carefully curated image of control and superiority simply disappears. Their arrogance, their assumption that stories exist in isolation, becomes the very thing that triggers public shame, and the collapse of their self-image is both inevitable and unavoidable. Number 12. They were performing strength instead of actually developing it. For years they carried themselves as though they were unbreakable, as if pressure and scrutiny would simply bend around them rather than ever touch them. People believed it, and so did they. Every confident word, every bold action, every display of composure was carefully performed to convince the world and themselves that they were strong. But there is a critical difference between performing strength and actually having it. Performance relies on appearances, on timing, and on control, while real strength survives scrutiny, adversity, and unexpected challenges without flinching. When exposure arrives, the performance crumbles because it was never built to withstand reality. It was only built to impress reality. They thrived on applause, on nods, on the recognition that comes from appearing capable. That applause reinforced the illusion that they were strong, but it never tested the foundation beneath the surface. Performed strength can look flawless in the right conditions, but real strength shows up in chaos when control is stripped away, when no one is watching, and when the consequences are immediate and unavoidable. Exposure does not wait for rehearsals. It comes uninvited, unplanned, and completely unforgiving. The person performing strength suddenly finds themselves unable to navigate the pressure they once seemed to manage so effortlessly. Their ego, once inflated by appearance, collapses under the reality it was never built to endure. The shock of exposure is particularly harsh because it reveals the difference between perception and substance. People realize they were only observing a skillful act, not an actual capacity to handle difficulty. And the person experiencing it feels the weight of every moment they relied on performance over preparation, on image over integrity, and on impression over authenticity. It is humiliating because the strength they thought defined them was never actually theirs. It was borrowed from the assumptions of others, from the reactions of an audience, and from circumstances that were always favorable until they suddenly were not. In the end, exposure does not just reveal weakness, it exposes the ego's complete dependence on illusion. They learn, often painfully, that real strength cannot be faked, cannot be borrowed, and cannot survive solely on performance. When the spotlight shifts from admiration to scrutiny, performance fades, leaving only the raw truth behind. Their strength was an act, and the world has finally seen the difference. Number 13. They never expected the quietest person in the room to notice everything. They always underestimated the quiet ones. The people who sat back, observed carefully, and never raised their voice were dismissed as unimportant, irrelevant, or too passive to matter. They believed influence belonged to the loudest, to the boldest, to the most visible. Their ego thrived on attention, on reactions, on people responding exactly as expected. They assumed the quiet people were not paying attention, that they were not noticing inconsistencies, contradictions, or gaps in the story. That assumption became a ticking time bomb, waiting patiently for the right moment to explode. The quiet observer notices everything. They see the small gestures, the subtle lies, the micro-expressions that reveal far more than words ever could. They remember details that the ego believes have been forgotten. They connect the dots that the performer assumed would remain isolated. And when exposure comes from someone who was assumed invisible, it hits harder than anything else because it is completely unexpected. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is precise, undeniable, and impossible to dismiss. The person whose ego thrived on visibility realizes too late that the one they ignored has been quietly documenting every misstep, every exaggeration, and every facade. What makes this revelation so brutal is that it exposes both arrogance and vulnerability simultaneously. The ego assumed control because it believed it understood the dynamics of every room it entered. It assumed it could predict who mattered and who did not. But the quiet observer does not play by those rules. Their attention is patient, consistent, and almost always underestimated. When they speak, when they finally reveal what they have noticed, it is not just proof of scrutiny. It is proof that the ego has been completely blind to reality the entire time. The collapse that follows is swift and total. The person realizes that all the performance, all the confidence, all the careful manipulation of perception was observed and analyzed by someone they thought did not even matter. The shame is sharp because it is not just about being exposed. It is about being exposed by someone they never thought was capable of seeing through them in the first place. The quietest person in the room becomes the catalyst for truth, and the ego, which believed it controlled every narrative, is left powerless, raw, and completely exposed. Number 14. The shame is not really about the exposure itself. It is about losing the version of themselves they believed was permanent. The cruelest part of being exposed is not the public embarrassment, the criticism, or the judgment of others. It is the complete collapse of identity. It is the sudden realization that the person they believed themselves to be was never real to begin with. For years they built a version of themselves that felt untouchable, admired, and superior. Every word, every action, every calculated display reinforced that identity. They convinced themselves that it was permanent, that it was theirs to keep regardless of circumstances or scrutiny. Exposure does not just challenge that illusion, it obliterates it completely. When the facade falls, the ego does not just feel vulnerable, it feels irrelevant. The confidence they relied on, the admiration they assumed was eternal, and the respect they thought was guaranteed all disappear in a single moment. What remains is raw, undeniable truth. The version of themselves they trusted, the one they performed every single day, was never grounded in substance. They begin to realize that their identity was borrowed entirely from perception, from reactions, and from the assumptions of others. And when that borrowed identity is stripped away, shame does not just arrive. It floods every corner of their awareness without mercy. The intensity of this shame comes from its permanence. Public exposure may be temporary, but the internal reckoning is ongoing. They must live with the knowledge that their carefully constructed self-image has been dismantled, that admiration was always conditional, and that the world sees them differently than they ever saw themselves. It is a moment that changes the way they view every past action, every choice, and every interaction they have ever had. They recognize that they invested in appearances over authenticity, in performance over integrity, and in borrowed approval over earned respect. And this realization cuts deeper than any external judgment ever could, because it is intimate, unavoidable, and entirely internal. Exposure did not invent shame. It revealed it, amplified it, and made it undeniable. The loss is not just of reputation, it is the loss of the self they believed was permanent. That version of themselves, the one they clung to and defended for so long, evaporates, leaving only the unvarnished reality behind. And in that void, the ego faces the harshest truth of all. Identity built on illusion cannot survive exposure, and the shame that follows is the echo of what they never truly had. The story of an ego exposed is never just about embarrassment. It is a deep, unsettling revelation that shakes the foundation of who someone thought they were. Every point we have explored reveals the same undeniable truth. When identity is built on perception, on control, on borrowed power, or on performance rather than substance, it cannot withstand real scrutiny. Confidence becomes a mask. Authority becomes fragile. Admiration is mistaken for respect, and influence that relied on silence or fear collapses the moment clarity arrives. The quiet observer, the accumulated evidence, the contradictions hidden inside stories, all of it patiently waits for the moment when the illusion can no longer hide. What we see in someone whose ego has been exposed is not just shame. It is the collision between fantasy and reality. It is the painful awakening that the version of themselves they believed to be permanent was never real. Every carefully constructed image, every moment of assumed invincibility, every display of strength or indispensability, once stripped away, leaves them confronting a truth they were never ready to face. Exposure does not just reveal mistakes. It reveals character or the absence of it, and forces a reckoning that is as intimate as it is public. The fall is not just social, it is internal, relentless, and unforgettable. And yet, there is a lesson hidden within this collapse. The very things that expose someone, truth, attention, scrutiny, honesty, are also the tools that allow them to rebuild. Real strength, real respect, and real authority do not rely on perception. They survive in clarity. The difference between shame and growth lies in what comes after. Exposure strips away the false, but it also creates space for authenticity, for resilience, and for a version of self that no one can ever take away. So take a moment to reflect on this. Whether you have witnessed it in others or felt it yourself, understand that exposure is the ultimate truth teller. It cannot be avoided and it cannot be ignored.